In the first week of June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed toward a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with the largest carrier strike force ever assembled. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, made up a force that had not known defeat. These were the same ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor. These were the same pilots who had sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya. These were the same commanders who had swept through the Pacific like a typhoon, seizing the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and a string of island bases stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. They had not lost a single fleet engagement. They had not lost a single carrier. They believed, with good reason, that they were invincible. By the end of June 7th, all 4 of those carriers were burning wrecks at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. 275 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. More than 2,400 Japanese sailors and pilots were dead, including many of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, had lost the core of its offensive power in a single morning. And the battle that accomplished this was not won by superior numbers or superior technology. It was won by codebreakers, by luck, by a series of decisions made in the span of minutes, and by the almost incomprehensible courage of American pilots who flew obsolete aircraft into the teeth of the most powerful naval force on Earth, knowing that most of them would not return. The story of Midway begins not at sea, but in a basement in Pearl Harbor, where a team of intelligence analysts had been working around the clock for months, trying to crack the Japanese naval code. The code was called JN-25, and it was fiendishly complex. The Japanese changed it regularly. The Americans, under the direction of Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been piecing together fragments, intercepting Japanese radio traffic, and slowly, painfully, building a picture of what the Imperial Navy was planning. By May of 1942, Rochefort and his team had made a breakthrough. They had intercepted enough messages to know that the Japanese were planning a major operation against a target identified only by the code designation AF. Rochefort was certain that AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand about 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Midway was barely 2 square miles of land, but it was strategically vital. It was the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific, a forward base for submarines and long-range reconnaissance aircraft. If the Japanese took Midway, they could use it as a springboard to threaten Hawaii itself. But the admirals in Washington were not convinced. The Japanese could be planning to attack anywhere: Alaska, the West Coast, even a return strike on Pearl Harbor. Rochefort needed proof, so he devised a ruse. He had the Midway garrison send a radio message, using a code the Japanese were known to have broken, reporting that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, American listening stations intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The target was confirmed: Midway. The trap was set. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now knew where the Japanese were coming. He did not know exactly when, and he did not know the full composition of their forces, but he knew enough to make a decision that was either brilliant or reckless, depending on your perspective. He would concentrate his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, and he would ambush the Japanese fleet as it approached. The Japanese plan, devised by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was characteristically elaborate. Yamamoto was the architect of Pearl Harbor, a brilliant strategist who understood that Japan's only hope against the industrial might of the United States was a quick, decisive victory that would force America to negotiate. He had opposed war with the United States before it began, but once the decision was made, he had committed himself to winning it. The Midway operation involved more than 100 ships, divided into multiple groups, spread across the Central and North Pacific. 4 fast carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would strike Midway, softening its defenses for an invasion. A separate force would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska as a diversion. Yamamoto himself would follow with a battleship force, ready to engage the American fleet when it sortied from Pearl Harbor. The plan assumed that the Americans would not know where the main blow was falling until it was too late. It assumed that the American carriers would not arrive until after Midway was already in Japanese hands. It assumed, in short, that the Imperial Navy still held the initiative. Every one of these assumptions was wrong. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Nagumo's carrier force was in position, about 240 miles northwest of Midway. The sea was calm, the sky was overcast. The four carriers turned into the wind and began launching their strike aircraft, more than 100 planes, bombers and fighters, headed for Midway. Nagumo kept a second wave on deck, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case American ships appeared. The strike on Midway inflicted significant damage. Japanese bombers hit the fuel storage tanks, the seaplane hangars, and the airstrip. But the defenders on Midway had been warned. They were ready. Anti-aircraft fire was intense. And the American aircraft based on Midway, a motley collection of Navy Catalinas, Army B-17 flying fortresses, Marine dive bombers, and even a squadron of obsolete Buffalo fighters, fought back with everything they had. They were outmatched, but they were not passive. They attacked the Japanese carrier force repeatedly, and although they scored no hits, they forced Nagumo to keep his carriers maneuvering, disrupting flight operations. And then came the report that changed everything. A Japanese scout plane, delayed by a catapult malfunction, finally got airborne and spotted American ships to the northeast. The report was frustratingly vague. It did not specify whether the ships included carriers. Nagumo faced an agonizing decision. His first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land. His second wave was on the flight decks of all four carriers, armed with anti-ship weapons, torpedoes for attacking warships, armor-piercing bombs for attacking land targets on Midway. Should he launch the second wave immediately against the American ships, while the first wave circled overhead, waiting to land and eventually ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea? Or should he recover the first wave, rearm and refuel everyone, and then launch a coordinated strike? Nagumo chose the latter. Coordinated strike? Nagumo chose the latter. It was the doctrinally correct decision. It was also, in retrospect, fatal. While the Japanese carriers were recovering aircraft and frantically rearming their strike planes. It was the doctrinally correct decision. It was also, in retrospect, fatal. While the Japanese carriers were recovering aircraft and frantically rearming their strike planes, bombs and torpedoes stacked on the hangar decks, fuel hoses snaking across the flight decks, a chaos of ordnance and aviation gas that made the ships floating powder kegs. The American carrier planes were already in the air. The Americans had launched their strike that morning from the three carriers northeast of Midway. The attacks came in waves, and the first waves were slaughtered. The torpedo squadrons went in first. Torpedo 8 from Hornet, flying obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators, slow, underarmed death traps against the Japanese Zero fighters, pressed their attacks with a courage that still defies comprehension. 15 planes from Torpedo 8 took off that morning. All 15 were shot down. Of the 30 men who flew them, only one survived. Ensign George Gay, wounded and floating in the water, watched the rest of the battle from beneath a seat cushion, hiding from Japanese strafing runs. Torpedo 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 10 planes. 4 survived. Torpedo 3 from Yorktown went in. 12 planes. 2 survived. In less than an hour, 3 American torpedo squadrons had been virtually annihilated. 41 Devastators had been launched. 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese carrier. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was not in vain. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zero fighters defending the carriers, had been drawn down to sea level, chasing the slow American torpedo planes. The Zeros had exhausted their ammunition and were out of position. The skies above the Japanese carriers, at the critical moment, were empty. And then the dive bombers arrived. the dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown squadrons, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for more than 2 hours. They were running low on fuel. Some of them would not have enough to make it back to their carriers. McCluskey, faced with the choice of turning back or continuing the search, made the most consequential decision of the battle. He kept going. At 10:20 in the morning, McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer hurrying north. He followed it, and there, spread out below him on the blue Pacific, were the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steaming in a loose formation, their decks crowded with rearming aircraft, their defenders out of position, their fate hanging in the air. The American dive bombers tipped over and dove. A dauntless dive bomber attacks by screaming down at a 70-degree angle, aiming directly at its target, releasing its bomb at about 1,500 feet, and pulling out so violently that the pilot blacks out for a moment from the G-forces. It is a terrifying way to fight. It requires the pilot to fly directly into anti-aircraft fire, directly into the enemy ship, holding his course while tracer rounds streak past his canopy. The Japanese had perhaps 5 minutes of warning. 5 minutes to understand what was happening, to try to get fighters aloft, to try to clear their decks. It was not enough. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding one of Enterprise's dive bomber squadrons, put a 1,000-pound bomb through the flight deck of the Akagi. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck, where it detonated among the fully armed and fueled aircraft being prepared for launch. The explosions were instantaneous and catastrophic. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship. Fires spread through the hangar deck, fed by aviation fuel and ordnance, igniting one aircraft after another. Within minutes, Akagi was an inferno. Admiral Nagumo was physically dragged from the bridge by his staff, protesting, refusing to leave. The ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was dying. At the same moment, the Kaga took 4 direct hits. Bombs smashed through her flight deck, detonating among her own rearming aircraft. The fires were so intense that they melted the glass in the bridge windows. Kaga's captain was killed instantly. The ship became a floating furnace, her hull glowing red in places from the heat. The Soryu took 3 hits. The first bomb struck directly in front of the bridge. The second and third hit amid the aircraft on the flight deck. Within 20 minutes, the fires were out of control, and Soryu's engines had stopped. Her crew was ordered to abandon ship. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had formed the core of the Imperial Japanese Navy's striking power were reduced to burning, drifting wreckages. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been steaming ahead of the main formation and was not hit in the initial attack. She would survive for a few more hours. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the carrier division from Hiryu, was a man of extraordinary composure. With 3 carriers burning around him, he did not retreat. He launched a counterstrike. 2 waves of Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes found the USS Yorktown, and they hit her hard. The first wave put 3 bombs into her flight deck. The second wave, hours later, put 2 torpedoes into her side. Yorktown went dead in the water, listing heavily. Her crew abandoned ship. But Yorktown was not done. Salvage crews reboarded her the next day and began efforts to save her. They might have succeeded had a Japanese submarine not found her 3 days later and put 2 more torpedoes into her. Yorktown sank on June 7th. She was the only American carrier lost at Midway. The Hiryu did not survive the day. Late on the afternoon of June 4th, American scout planes found her. Enterprise and Hornet launched a strike of dive bombers. 4 bombs hit Hiryu directly, setting her flight deck ablaze from stem to stern. Admiral Yamaguchi, choosing to go down with his ship, ordered his crew to abandon the carrier and then stood on the bridge with his captain, watching the fires consume his command. At dawn on June 5th, a Japanese destroyer scuttled Hiryu with torpedoes to prevent her from being captured. Yamaguchi was last seen on the bridge, his face illuminated by the flames as the sea closed over him. The Battle of Midway was over. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 275 aircraft, and more than 2,400 of its finest sailors and aviators. The United States Navy had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, about 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The battle had lasted 3 days. But the war in the Pacific had turned in 5 minutes. The Japanese High Command did not immediately understand the scale of what had happened. The loss of the carriers was kept secret even within the Imperial Navy. Wounded sailors returning to Japan were quarantined to prevent them from speaking about what they had seen. The Japanese public was told that Midway had been a great victory, that American carriers had been sunk, that the war was proceeding according to plan. But Admiral Yamamoto, alone in his cabin aboard the super battleship Yamato, understood. He had lost the carriers, he had lost the pilots, he had lost the offensive power that had carried Japan across the Pacific. From this point forward, the Imperial Navy would fight on the defensive, and against an enemy with the industrial capacity of the United States, an enemy that would launch 26 fleet carriers in the next 3 years, while Japan would manage to build only 5, a defensive war was a losing war. The reasons for the Japanese defeat at Midway have been debated for 8 decades. Some point to Nagumo's fatal decision to rearm his aircraft, the 5 minutes of vulnerability that cost him his carriers. Some point to the over-complexity of Yamamoto's plan, which divided the Japanese fleet into too many groups, too far apart, unable to support each other. Some point to the failure of Japanese reconnaissance, the scout plane whose delayed launch prevented the early detection of the American carriers. Some point to the hubris of an officer corps that had never known defeat and could not imagine that the Americans would dare to ambush them. All of these explanations are true, but they all miss the deeper truth. Japan lost at Midway because Japan had already lost the war before it began. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been intended to cripple the American fleet, to buy Japan 6 months to a year in which it could seize the resources of Southeast Asia and build an impregnable defensive perimeter. It had achieved that objective. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical triumph, but Pearl Harbor had also awakened a giant that could not be defeated by tactical triumphs alone. In the first 6 months of 1942, the United States was losing the war. But it was also building the war machine that would win it. The ships that would carry the fight across the Pacific were already under construction. The pilots who would fly from their decks were already in training. The codebreakers who would read Japan's most secret communications were already at work. Midway was not an accident. It was the first sign that the mathematics of the war had shifted. The Japanese pilots who died at Midway were irreplaceable. The Imperial Navy's pre-war training program, legendary for its rigor, had produced perhaps the finest naval aviators in the world. But that program graduated only about 100 pilots a year. The Americans, by 1944, were graduating more than 10,000. The Japanese carriers that burned at Midway could not be replaced quickly enough. Japanese shipyards, constrained by material shortages and industrial bottlenecks, could not match American production. The Essex-class carriers began entering service in 1943. By 1944, the United States had more fleet carriers in the Pacific than Japan had ever built in its entire history. This is the cold reality that the drama of Midway obscures. The battle was not a miracle. It was not luck, although luck played a role. It was the collision between an industrial democracy that was just beginning to mobilize and a military autocracy that had already reached the limits of its power. Japan had gambled that it could win a short war. Midway proved that the war would not be short, and a long war against the United States was a war Japan could not win. But the men who fought at Midway did not know any of this. They did not know about production statistics and training pipelines and the long arc of industrial mobilization. They knew only that the enemy was below them, that their friends were dying around them, that they were afraid, and that they had a job to do. The torpedo bomber pilots who flew into the Japanese fleet knowing their planes were obsolete. The dive bomber pilots who followed the wake of a destroyer to find the enemy. The deck crews who scrambled to rearm and refuel aircraft while bombs were falling. the sailors below decks who fought fires and flooded magazines and died in the darkness, never knowing whether their sacrifice had meant anything. They were the ones who won the battle. They were the ones who turned the war, and most of them are forgotten now, their names lost to history, their faces preserved only in fading photographs, their voices only in letters written the night before they flew and never sent. The Pacific War would grind on for 3 more years after Midway. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The names of the battles that followed are carved into the memory of the American military in letters of blood and fire. The Japanese would fight with a ferocity and tenacity that stunned the Americans who faced them. They would not surrender. They would not retreat. They would die where they stood, and they would take as many Americans with them as they could. The war would end only with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the unconditional surrender of Japan in September of 1945. But after Midway, the outcome of the war was never in doubt. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost the core of its offensive power. It would never again launch a major offensive operation in the Pacific. It would fight defensive battles, desperate battles, battles of attrition that it could not win. But it would never again threaten Hawaii, or the American West Coast, or the sea lanes that connected the United States to Australia. The tide had turned. And it had turned on a June morning, in 5 minutes, over a tiny atoll in the middle of the world's largest ocean. The wreckage of the 4 Japanese carriers still lies on the ocean floor, nearly 3 miles down, in the cold darkness of the abyssal Pacific. The Akagi was discovered by a research vessel in 2019. The cargo was found a week later. The Soryu and Hiryu remain undiscovered as of the time of this recording, somewhere in the vast underwater canyons northwest of Midway. They are war graves now, protected by international law, the final resting place of the men who died aboard them. The American pilots who survived Midway came home to a country that was just beginning to understand the scale of the war it had entered. Some of them would fly again, in other battles, from other carriers. Some of them would not survive the next mission. Richard Best, the pilot whose bomb destroyed the Akagi, would never fly combat again. The effects of breathing pure oxygen during his dive had damaged his lungs. He lived until 2001, long enough to see the nation he had defended become the dominant power in the world his sacrifice had helped create. And at Pearl Harbor, in the headquarters where Rochefort's codebreakers had cracked the Japanese plans, there was a quiet sense of vindication. The intelligence that had made Midway possible had been doubted by many in Washington. After the battle, the doubters fell silent. Code breaking had become an essential weapon of the war. The men who practiced it, working in windowless rooms, staring at columns of numbers until their eyes blurred, had proved that wars are not won by ships and planes alone. They are won by information, by knowing what the enemy will do before the enemy knows it himself. Midway was not the largest naval battle of the Second World War. It was not the bloodiest, it was not the longest. But it was the battle that made all the other battles possible, the hinge upon which the entire Pacific War swung from Japanese expansion to Japanese retreat. And it was won by men who knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched, and who flew into the fight anyway.